Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Word of the Day podcast, where I, Jamie Silva, make it my habit to pleasantly explain useful words. Today's word has more syllables than usual, so get ready. It's supercilious. And here to discuss it with me is the very talented voice actor, appearing now for her second time on the program, Jackie. Jackie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jamie. Happy to be here.
Okay, let's talk about supercilious, which I think you'll find is both pretty handy and very fun to say. In my view, this adjective means arrogant and condescending, possibly even contemptuous and snooty. So, supercilious people are always looking down their noses at others. They like to feel superior, and they might spend much of their day doing just that. They cast supercilious glances, they make supercilious remarks to other supercilious people under their breath, and they would sooner dine on dry toast than fraternize with folks they consider inferior. Unsurprisingly, this word is an insult. You really did not want to be thought of as supercilious.
Checking in with the online definition of supercilious, it goes like this, quote, behaving or looking as though one thinks one is superior to others, unquote. So this is pretty on the money. It mentions that sense of superiority and notice as well that it references both behavior and expression, i.e. your overall appearance or look. This is important because you don't have to spell out your condescending thoughts verbally in order to be quite supercilious. Or perhaps we should say supercilious.
Right. In a lot of cases, superciliousness is all about your attitude, your general demeanor. Now, the word snooty, which I included in my definition, is also a really important element of supercilious. So much so that I think we ought to define it separately. Quote, showing disapproval or contempt toward others, especially those considered to belong to a lower social class, unquote. Now, notice how this hints at the idea of class, and how the higher classes, stereotypically at least, often look down upon the lower.
If you're wondering what this looks like, think of any period drama, preferably set in Victorian or turn of the 20th century England. One that features a plucky peasant or shopkeeper's daughter who suddenly finds herself surrounded by city folk or landed gentry or fine ladies and gentlemen, counts and countesses, earls and whatever the female equivalent of an earl was.
An earless?
Well, that's spelled just like earless, which might imply that she lacked ears. What about an earlette?
I'm afraid that's not very good either. But okay, so if we investigate a bit online, it appears wives of earls were just known as countesses.
All right. Well, if I see one, I'll be sure to address her properly. What were we talking about?
Supercilious earlesses.
Oh, right. So it's a virtual certainty that in these film or TV settings, the hero will face a constant onslaught of arrogant remarks, haughty sidelong glances, and snide comments about her background from the meaner members of whatever social circles she finds herself in.
Absolutely. They probably feel threatened by her wit and good looks. And so they'll desperately try to put her in her place by means of all those supercilious behaviors you just mentioned. One of my favorite examples here is that of the Bingley sisters, Caroline and Louisa, from the great Jane Austen novel Pride and Prejudice. And without recapping the whole plot for you, these two are immensely rude to the Bennet sisters, who are the central characters. In fact, Caroline and Louisa take every opportunity to hint at their own wealth, sophistication, and connections while denigrating those of the Miss Bennets. So, if you want to see what a truly supercilious attitude looks like, we would advise that you read Pride and Prejudice or watch the BBC television adaptation, which is our personal favorite.
That it is. Now, what we want to zero in on here is how the supercilious attitudes of the Bingley sisters mainly stem from their need to assert their higher social class, their superior breeding, or, to borrow from Lady Catherine of the same novel, their desire to keep the distinctions of rank preserved.
And the word supercilious definitely carries this undertone of hierarchy, where the supercilious person is implying, or certainly acting as if, they're in a higher class than other people. And if all the riffraff would just clear out and stop bothering us, we, the superior people, will finally be left alone to act all superior towards each other.
Switching gears here, you might wonder what's up with the super in supercilious. Like, what's it for? Does it mean that it's possible to just be cilious rather than supercilious? Like, as Michael Scott of the TV show The Office put it,
I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious.
Obviously, this is not correct usage for superstitious, and supercilious works in much the same way, in that, sadly, you cannot say that you are just somewhat cilious. Rather than conveying the idea that you're only moderately snooty, it sounds like you're describing yourself as the silliest, the most flighty, or the least serious person around. This is a nice segue, actually, into the etymology of supercilious.
Oh, but actually, may I add a quick note on the etymology of the word snooty? It's just too good to pass up.
Yeah, go for it.
So apparently this word originated in the early 20th century as college slang, very likely because snoot was a Scottish variation, or maybe just pronunciation, of snout, which of course refers to one's nose. So to call someone snooty/snouty could very well have been a way of saying they look down their noses at people.
Hey, that's pretty cool. So if you want to call someone snobbish and haughty and confuse them at the same time, go ahead and refer to their insufferable snoutiness. Now, back to supercilious. Jackie, you were right to point out that super surely has to be doing something there, but it isn't what you might think. See, super in Latin meant, among other things, above, as in the extra soap is in the cupboard above the sink.
That's kind of interesting when you think of words like superhero, which would literally mean like a hero who is above or beyond other heroes.
True, although the super in supercilious is much more concrete. You see, the word cilium in Latin meant eyelid, and thus the word supercilium literally meant above the eyelid. And what, Jackie, is above the eyelid?
The eyebrow.
Exactly. So supercilium in Latin could either mean eyebrow or it could mean pride or a haughty demeanor. And there's this really neat parallel with snooty happening here. See, just like snooty comes from the word snout and implies you're kind of looking down your nose at someone, supercilium comes from /is a word meaning eyebrow, and raising an eyebrow at someone is a classic method of expressing pride or superiority. I mean, it can mean other things too, but I think we can all agree it works great as a supercilious facial expression. All right, I think it's now time to explore what supercilious looks like in ordinary conversation or writing. Example number 1. Baroness Helga von Munchington listened skeptically to the local shopkeeper's fashion recommendations. Why, even our chambermaids have finer petticoats than these, she said with a supercilious air. We wouldn't be caught dead in them. Haven't you got anything that befits our station in life, or just fits at all for that matter?
Example number 2. With his chin in the air and a faint, supercilious smile upon his face, Count Dogula, a Great Dane, towered over the other dogs at the park.
Example number 3. So, Mark works as a freelance DJ, is that right, dear? Mrs. Crawford inquired of her daughter, with a supercilious glance across the table at Mark, her boyfriend. Tell me, Mark, with DJing, is that something one learns in college? Or was that, shall we say, not necessary in your case? And I should point out here, before an army of freelance DJs write in to say how insulting this is, that we totally agree that was an uncalled for and almost certainly inaccurate thing to say or insinuate.
Yeah, poor Mark. Jamie and I plan to upbraid Mrs. Crawford for her rudeness the next time she invites us over for dinner. All right, moving on to example number 4, which is mildly paraphrased from, and how fitting is this, Pride and Prejudice. Quote, Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in the town of Meryton, where he had made a tolerable fortune, and had risen to the honor of knighthood. The distinction had perhaps been felt too strongly, for, quitting his business as well as his residence in the small market town, he had moved with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton, where he could think with pleasure of his own importance, and, unshackled by business, occupy himself solely in being civil to all the world. For, though elated by his rank, it did not render him supercilious. On the contrary, he was all attention to everybody." Unquote.
This passage is, of course, very much tongue-in-cheek, since this relatively insignificant and unimpressive man, though immensely pleased with himself, steadfastly refuses to consider himself better than others, who are actually very much his peers, notwithstanding his comfortable estate and his fancy title. All right, let's move on to one more here. Example number 5, which comes from the wonderful short story or fable or allegory, I'm not sure which, The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde. Jackie and I will read a couple different portions of it because it's wonderfully written and could not be a better description of superciliousness. So, starting out, you'll hear part of a conversation amongst a bunch of firecrackers that will soon be set off to celebrate a prince's marriage feast. Quote, "Suddenly, a sharp, dry cough was heard, and all the fireworks looked round. It came from a tall, supercilious-looking rocket who was tied to the end of a long stick. He always coughed before he made any observation, so as to attract attention."
As soon as there was perfect silence, the rocket coughed a third time and began. He spoke with a very slow, distinct voice, as if he was dictating his memoirs, and he always looked over the shoulder of the person to whom he was talking. In fact, he had a most distinguished manner. "How fortunate it is for the king's son," he remarked, "that he is to be married on the very day on which I am to be set off. Really, if it had been arranged beforehand, it could not have turned out better for him. But then again, princes are always lucky.
And then, from later in the story, quote, all the fireworks were a great success at the wedding celebration, except for the remarkable rocket. He was so damp with crying, and by the way, this is because he had been moved to tears earlier by his great fondness for the prince. He was so damp that he could not go off at all. The best thing in him was the gunpowder, and that was so wet with tears that it was of no use.
All his poor relations, to whom he would never speak, except with a sneer, shot up into the sky like wonderful golden flowers with blossoms of fire. Huzzah! Cried the court, and the little princess laughed with pleasure.
I suppose they are reserving me for some grand occasion, said the rocket. No doubt that is what it means. And he looked more supercilious than ever.
The next day, the workmen came to put everything tidy. This is evidently a deputation, said the rocket. A deputation, by the way, is like a group of diplomats or public officials sent to welcome a visitor of great importance. I will receive them with becoming dignity. And so he put his nose in the air and began to frown severely, as if he were thinking about some very important subject.
But the workmen took no notice of him at all till they were just going away. Then one of them caught sight of him. "Hello," he cried. "What a bad rocket!" And he threw him over the wall into the ditch.
Bad rocket? He said as he whirled through the air. Impossible. Grand rocket. That is what the man said. Bad and grand sound very much the same. Indeed, they often are the same. And he fell into the mud.
And after suffering a few more indignities, the rocket does go off and expires, still as supercilious as ever. Alrighty folks, that'll do it for the examples and for today's show. I sure enjoyed hosting this episode of the Word of the Day podcast. And Jackie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jamie.
Thanks so much to everyone for tuning in. And if you like the show, please do tell a friend. And of course, if you didn't like it, just keep your opinions to yourself. For now, this is Jamie Silva saying so long from the RAV4 Studios. We'll see you next time.